Hello, my name is Harold Anderson. I'm a retired marriage and family therapist, have taught philosophy and theology for more than 23 years, and I am also retired United Methodist minister. As I have watched in horror the events defining the election of Donald Trump, I was reminded of a small book I read more than 40 years ago, a book written by Walter Brueggemann introducing readers to the prophetic imagination. Its insights are prescient, but Brueggemann has also written a more recent book, Ancient Echoes, in which he confronts Trump and the religious right with the ancient echoes of Scripture. I will separate my discussion into two parts, the first summarizing the prophetic imagination, and then in a second video, a second part exploring Brueggemann's work in Ancient Echoes. Part 1. More than 40 years ago, Walter Brueggemann published a little book which grounded his readers in the prophetic tradition, a tradition that recalls the enslaved history of the Hebrew people and the liberation that brought them to the Promised Land, a land that was to become a great nation. However, greatness is not without its perils, and the ministry of the prophets was to remind the kings of Israel, including David, that the privileges of kingship is not marked by power and prosperity, but by responsibility to care for the poor, the widowed, orphans, and all those enslaved by the challenges of life. The promise of God was not a promise of riches and power. It was a promise of liberation for all people, which implies an ethic of compassion, care, and justice. The book was called The Prophetic Imagination, which was first published in 1978. In his book, Brueggemann introduces readers to the power of the prophetic texts, which awaken within people a sense of justice rooted in what he calls a hermeneutic of liberation, a hermeneutic that grows out of the existential challenges of everydayness. It is this context that birthed the prophetic vision written about in Scripture, yet it is a vision that is very much alive today. Throughout the millennia, the prophetic vision has inspired people to confront the dominant powers of royal consciousness in all its forms. To get at this, Brueggemann produces a leitmotif that plays on the conflict between the prophets, the king, and their royal court. The point of the book is to liberate the, quote, relatively powerless prophetic voice, end quote, to confront contemporary instances of totalizing powers enslaving many in the favor of a few. The leitmotif that plays prophet against king, however, is a metaphor that flies from the pages of Scripture to challenge and deconstruct the hegemony of totalizing powers that oppress marginalized populations. For the prophets never side with the oppressors. Their voice is always on the side of the oppressed, and justice defines a time when hegemony crumbles and those enslaved are freed. This is the faith that became the imaginative framework in which the diasporic Judaism survived. It is the faith that inspired the message and the work of Jesus of Nazareth. It is the faith that emboldened women's suffrage, that won women the vote, and beyond the vote, rights that few could imagine in 1920. It is the faith that inspired the civil rights movement and birthed Dr. Martin Luther King's dream where, quote, children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character, end quote. It is faith recognizing, quote, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, again from Martin Luther King Jr. It is a moral faith intolerant of hatred, greed, and a thirst for power, but open to all who embrace love, acceptance, and the goal of peace. The prophetic imagination and the texts that give them voice powerfully contest injustice wherever it may abide, and I thank Brueggemann for writing his book to remind us of that fact. However, the prophetic imagination dies if it lives only in words. It must empower the lives of people committed to the justice it defines. This commitment must go beyond words and find its reality in action. What group or institutions embrace the message of the prophets? Is it the church? And if so, what part of the church? Protestantism, Roman Catholicism, evangelicals, fundamentalists? Is it groups such as Black Lives Matters that continue the struggle of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.? If there is such a group, I'm convinced that it is the voice of a marginalized group, a voice to which we must listen. We must seek to understand their concerns, their hopes, and their dreams. It is these groups that should guide our efforts, for it is in them that the prophetic voice is heard. Jack Kumar Christian, writing from the perspective of the Christian church, states, "The church in the margins must challenge the tendencies of totalizing systems, structures, and people to play God in the lives of those on the margins. The church needs to challenge the status quo and offer a counter-narrative on power that radically challenges these gods. This requires more than mere participation and empowerment. It demands challenging the power assumptions that reinforce oppression and exploitation." According to Christian, the powerful reduce the poor to objects of production, economic and political pawns. To oppress marginalized people like this is a ploy on the part of the powerful to divide the marginalized groups and pit them against one another. This cannot be tolerated by those inspired and empowered by the vision and message of the prophets, including Jesus, the one the Christian church proclaims to serve, and should evoke a deep-seated rage in the hearts of those committed to the prophetic vision. Prophetic rage should motivate the just to speak against the powerful and indict their unjust ways. This ends the first part. In the second part, I will examine how Brueggemann brings the prophetic voice and the ancient echoes of Scripture against the unjust and often inhumane ways of Trump and the religious right.